My name is Edith Devaney. I'm one of the board members of ICRA. And the next section is, I want to introduce Rachel Churner. Rachel is the director of the Carolee Schneemann Foundation. And this is very timely, of course, because many of you might have visited the exhibition on Carolee Schneemann's work that is now on at the Barbican. It's a wonderful exhibition. And one of the things that Rachel is going to do is to give a presentation of Carolee Schneemann's work, but using one particular work up to and including her limit as a case study, which will really highlight some of the challenges that institutions and individuals and foundations face when documenting complex multidisciplinary works. After Rachel's recording is played, which was done in advance, Rachel will actually be with us virtually but live, and I will be asking her a few questions and questions following that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Churner. I'm the director of the Carolee Schneemann Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to preserving and promoting the legacy of Carolee Schneemann and advancing the understanding of her work through scholarship, exhibitions, and publications. I'm including a major retrospective at the Barbican Center through January 8th. And for all of you in London, I hope that you have a chance to see it. Just a small plug, the exhibition catalog by curator Lottie Johnson is really incredible. The foundation is also committed to supporting contemporary artists whose work is as experimental and transgressive as that of Schneemann. And to that end, we're planning a residency program for her home in New Paltz, which was the site of and muse for many of her films, paintings, and writings. One of our many long-term projects as an artist-endowed foundation is to create a catalog raisonné. Of course, such an undertaking comes with all sorts of challenges for any artist, but there are specific challenges for someone like Carolee. She defined herself as a painter, famously declaring, "I am a painter and I will die a painter. Everything that I've developed has to do with extending visual principles off the canvas." But her work indeed strayed far from the canvas and into performance, installation, video, and film, often involving all of these. And in fact, it is for performances like Meet Joy and Interior Scroll. Here I'm showing you this image, image one, which is a color image of Meet Joy by Al Giza and a black and white photo of Schneemann in Interior Scroll by Anthony McCall, that the artist is best known. Today, I'd like to explore one work in particular, up to and including her limits, created over a number of years in the 1970s as a case study for some of the questions that we grapple with as we try to define this work. And I'm showing you here the installation shot at the Barbican of the piece. And I hope that this will lead us to a lively discussion of how those of you in the audience have addressed these issues as we think about categorizing different artworks, in particular time-based performances, as well as understanding legacy in terms not only of production, but also of documentation and archiving and of editing and representation. For Schneemann was constantly reworking her own performances, incorporating footage and material from earlier presentations into the current one in a way that significantly altered the work at hand. And she did so over decades and decades. As one Artforum reviewer put it in 1980, quote, "Carolee Schneemann represents the muse of painting in the home of the genius of chaos." But before we discuss up to and including her limits in detail, I want to give a brief overview of the artist's work to provide a bit of context. Carolee Schneemann came of age as an artist in the mid-1950s, having been temporarily expelled from Bard College for moral turpitude after painting nude self-portraits. While suspended in 1954, she moved to New York and transferred her studies to Columbia University's School of Painting and Sculpture and the School for Social Research, where she attended life drawing classes which had not been offered at Bard. Paintings from the late 1950s, such as Arietta Duetto, shown here, show Schneemann painting nudes with vigorous gestural marks and saturated color palettes, which together activated the canvas. Soon she was literalizing the action by placing a canvas on a spinning potter's wheel and transforming it into, quote, "a flying rectangle of color," And what you're seeing here is the installation shot of Pinwheel at the Barbican. The piece is sort of left where it stops spinning, having been sort of literally activated every half an hour. In other works, like One Window is Clear, Notes to Lou Andreas Salome, which you see on the other side, she brought sound into the artwork by including heaps of audio tape, now silenced, of herself reading the writings of Salome, a Russian-born female psychoanalyst. As Schneemann expanded her painting constructions, her loft soon became its own environment with, as she describes it, panels interlocked by rhythmic color units, broken mirrors, glass, lights, moving umbrellas, and motorized parts. In 1953, Schneemann staged iBody, 36 transformative actions for camera among this environment. The work, and here we already start to confront the challenge of categorization critical to the catalogue raisonné, was the photographic documentation, the images taken by Eero, an Icelandic artist and friend of Schneemann, of a series of gestures loosely informed by her interest in ritual. And you can see here, the piece shows Schneemann in front of what would become four fur cutting boards with the plastic snakes and plastic sheeting around. All of these would be sort of incorporated into further transformative actions. Alongside these private performances, Schneemann began creating ensemble performances. And in the early 1960s, she became a founding member of the Judson Dance Theater, a group of interdisciplinary artists that included Yvonne Rainer, Lucinda Childs, Trisha Brown, and Steve Paxton, who took the gestures and materials of everyday life as their impetus. Meet Joy. And here I'm giving you a glimpse of the work from Carolee's scrapbook, was performed 3 times in 1964 as part of Jean-Jacques Labelle's Festival of Free Expression at the American Center in Paris, at Denison Hall in London, and at Judson Dance Theater in New York. Schneemann wrote, quote, "I had to get that nude off the canvas, frozen flesh to art history's conjunction of perceptual erotics and an immobilizing social position," end quote. Meet Joy did just that, bringing together 9 men and women in a, quote, celebration of flesh as material: raw fish, chicken, sausages, wet paint, transparent plastic, rope, brushes, paper scrap. Over a period of 80 minutes and multiple scenes, the fur bikini-clad dancers worked through a series of precisely determined movements that culminated with the men, quote, thoughtfully painting a woman's body faster and faster through 3,000 years of techniques, end quote, until they retaliate by throwing buckets of paint over them. Finally, the character Central Woman, played by Schneemann, yells enough, and a blackout ends the event. In the 1960s and 70s, Schneemann focused on filmmaking and solo performances that investigated her own body and its generative potential over time, often several years. She created a number of iconic works, including the important film Fuses, in which the celluloid footage of she and her partner, James Tinney, having sex had been painted, scratched, burned, baked, and more. The most famous of these performances is Interior Scroll from 1975, first presented as part of the Women Artists Here and Now exhibition in East Hampton, New York in 75, and then reprised for the Telluride Film Festival in Colorado in 1977. The image that you're seeing now is a large-scale collage in the collection of Tate Museum with images and text from the scroll that are from both performances, and the scroll text itself is a voiceover from Kitsch's Last Meal, a film that we'll soon hear about. Schneemann began by undressing and assuming a series of life-drawing poses while reading from her book Cézanne. She was a great painter. She then unraveled a paper scroll from her vagina, reciting a text typed on its delicate surface. Interior Scroll was perhaps Carolee's most resolutely feminist gesture, at least in terms of second-wave feminist manifestos of the 1970s. But hers was always a feminist practice in expansive terms, linking sexism to other structures of oppression, including colonialism, state violence, racism, animal cruelty, and war. Schneemann had made works about the horrors of the Vietnam War and our American consumption of images of suffering starting in the 1960s, and she continued to investigate the entwined nature of the personal and the global, connecting the intimate context of her home and relationships with the political and physical violence of the Vietnam War, the civil war in Lebanon, and the terrorist attacks of 9/11. As Lottie Johnson, curator of the Barbican exhibition, has explained, Schneemann was acutely sensitive to how these events suffused her life on a daily basis through newspaper headlines, printed images, the television, and later the internet. Works like More Wrong Things and Devour from 1999, 2006, place Schneemann's small town upstate New York experiences, like the destruction of the Demolition Derby, or even her own artworks, alongside interviews with war criminals, animal abuse, and the beating of protesters in Haiti. Again and again, she insisted on the body as both mediated and medium. And now, to sort of jump into the case study of Up to and Including Her Limits. Up to and Including Her Limits is a performance that incorporates a movie which is itself is in progress. The work therefore changes each time it is performed, not only because the conditions, the context, the space, and the audience change, but also because a different edit of the movie Kitsch's Last Meal and of her own performative actions are included. Having been presented numerous times over a 3-year period, it then became a video of a performance integrated into an installation that was itself variable, with sometimes 6, sometimes 3, sometimes 1 monitor, but also distributed as a single channel video piece in its own right. What I'm showing you here on the screen is a drawing that Schneemann made that I like just because it gives us some of the complexity of what we're seeing, right? So the corner of a room would have been lined with paper with a harness in the middle. Different monitors would have shown, as she says, up to and including Her Limits performance videotapes, but also Kitsch's Last Meal. And a projector would have shown no film. She's got Super 8 projector, no film, for no film labeled here in the end. Like many of Schneemann's works, Up to and Including Her Limits begins with a story. It is one that she told time and time again and edited frequently. Schneemann and her then husband, Anthony McCall, had returned from London in 1973 and were living in upstate New York in the 1970s Huguenot house that she owned in New Paltz. Schneemann had begun work on a film called Kitsch's Last Meal that was shot on Super 8. And here I'm just showing you an installation shot of the film that shot on Super 8 and ultimately presented as a vertical double projection. Tender portraits of the cat's numerous meals, each one potentially and eventually his last, were set alongside shots of her and Anthony's daily life in the country, attempting to sustain themselves on a few acres of land, while also doing the necessary work of being artists. It was an ambitious diary film that in some iterations was over 5 hours long, although the distributed version, finalized in the late 70s, was 54 minutes. It was a film about domesticity, daily life, fragility, and intimacy. And now to the origin story, and a quote from Carolee. You'll follow along on one of her edited versions of the story that's housed at the Getty Archives. One spring day in 1973, a new neighbor came to prune an old apple tree. He had a harness and ropes by which he raised and lowered himself and tools through the branches. Kitsch went out and watched him, and so I filmed Dwight at work. I asked him if I could try them. He said fine, and was perhaps as surprised as I was when the impulse to float naked in the harness took effect. Then Anthony came and took some footage of my free float. Once suspended in the harness, free of normal gravity, something started, which was to slowly evolve into a new performance work over the next 4 years, paralleling and then including the footage of KLM, Kitsch's Last Meal, which in turn included these first images of flying in the tree. Gravity had been something that Schneemann had been thinking about for several years, both in terms of Jackson Pollock's gestures and the properties of paint, and in terms of the body in motion. She'd worked with ropes and the ways of escaping gravity through suspension in the performance Waterlight Water Needle of 1966. In that work, inspired by her first visit to Venice, performers traipsed, crawled, and maneuvered their bodies and others along a series of ropes. The piece was first done inside at St. Mark's Church, and then outdoors with the ropes suspended between trees in rural New Jersey. She'd also used rope in a performance at the London Filmmakers Co-op in 1970. And thus, when Charlotte Moorman asked her to prepare an artwork for the 10th Avant-Garde Festival in New York, Schneemann decided to use the tree harness and rope as a key element, And I'm showing you here her collaged exhibition announcement for the piece at UC Berkeley, which shows you these 3 images by Anthony McCall of her sort of floating, her free float, as she called it. Trackings, which was the title of the first presentation of the work, took place in late December 1973 in a railway car in Grand Central Station. And the ceiling height of the rail car was too short for the harness, and the weather was too cold for her to perform nude, but Schneemann found a way to wrap the rope around herself and partially suspend her body as she drew with outstretched arms. And already we start to see some of the challenges, I think, of this work and of classifying it, right? Was this the first performance, given that it was the first to use paper and drawing and rope in the way that she was later to repeat it? Or was this the first public performance of what had been a private performance in the tree harness, which, because of its documentation by Anthony McCall and its subsequent inclusion in the film Kitch's Last Meal, was not quite as private as we may have assumed? Up to and including her limits was directly embedded in her painting practice. And it is, as an extension, even a literalization of what she called the physicalized painting process of Pollock. Schneemann said, "I function as a pencil. My entire body becomes the agency of marking and stroking." And I think with that lusciousness of the word stroking, she gets to the heart of the gendered relationship, as well as a feminist reclamation of a very masculine space. The work was not just about duration and physical endurance, although she did spend hours and hours in a harness making the drawings and even lived in the Berkeley Art Gallery for 2.5 days during an early presentation, but it was also about film. As an installation, the work incorporated film in multiple ways. She often screened the working versions of Kitch's Last Meal while making the drawing and lit her corner with the light of the projector, showing no film but spotlighting Schneemann's body as if it were in a film. The film's soundtrack was interrupted by the noise from the other projector, as well as from the audience and the artist. And in some iterations, video monitors screened both a live relay of the current action and footage from previous performances. And each time she performed it, and there were 4 additional performances in 1974 and 2 in 1976 at Artist Space, Anthology Film Archives, the Kitchen, Studio Gallery Berlin, to name a few, the footage of Kitch's Last Meal was different, having been edited in the interim months. Finally, in 1976, she played a completed version of Kitch's Last Meal while accompanied by the newly deceased cat. Right? The film itself ended at that last meal. When the work was presented as an installation, Schneemann showed footage of her performance most often on 6 monitors. The non-linear footage was therefore not documentation of the work, but the very material of it, evolving over the multiple iterations. Throughout the process, throughout these multiple years of the creation, Schneemann was grappling with the question of where she was, quote, more actual as an artist. In a diary film where she was both producer and subject, or in a public space, framed by projected light, where her actions could be viewed at any time. She asked, was I, as an artist, more real in the dailiness of the diary film, in the assumed active labor which produced the film, also as a film subject? Or was I more actual as a projected framed light in a public space, propelled to mark where my actions could be viewed at any time? For Schneemann, this piece, up to and including her limits, was a new type of performance, a lived public action, as she would have preferred. It stated it wasn't a well-planned group performance like those she had created for Judson, Meatjoy. It wasn't a solo presentation like Interior Scroll. She was alone, but it was in a liminal space between stage and studio, in public, but not acknowledging the public, not performed necessarily for an audience, but witnessed by them. Her aim, as she said, was to do away with things like audience duration, conscious intention, technical cues, central metaphors, and themes. And yet, of course, the piece itself is all about the limits of the physical body and the limits of medium itself. Film, installation, performance, drawing, video, all become kind of knotted together. And this, I think, is where we enter what I hope can open a discussion for us, right? Which is, the questions that we grapple with when thinking about Schneemann's work, right? What constitutes the performance? Is it the ephemera, the archival material, the documentation, props? Is it the installation made after the fact? What about representations of the performance? What constitutes the performance? Yes, and also how do you codify elements when they incorporate not only different media, but also separate artworks? And what about when elements are removed, right? Kitsch's Last Meal is no longer shown as part of the film itself, as part of the installation itself. So all of these are the things that we are grappling with for this question from the perspective of the catalog raisonné, and their works, images and questions that I hope we can discuss as we open it up to everyone in the audience. Thank you very much.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you very much for that presentation. And coming after Marina Abramovich that we had just before lunch, so many of the same themes, the same challenges to legacy were raised in your presentation. But I wanted to start off, Rachel, by asking you kind of a very general question, really, about the overall shape of thinking about the catalogue raisonné. And given that so much of Carolee Schneemann's later work includes strong strands of documentation, do you think in part that these provide some sort of roadmap as to how she might have wanted or hoped that her work would later be documented? And how much scrutiny should the catalogue raisonné team, which I know is headed by you, should they give to such documentation?
Thank you, Edith. It's a very important question, and I think it's one that we think about a lot. Carolee was a very proficient self-archivist. I mean, thinking very similarly probably to Marina Abramovich in terms of sort of always keeping material and archiving her stuff. She also prepared the way for us in certain aspects by publishing books that were in a sense sort of mini catalogue raisonné. So beyond, there's a book called More Than Meat Joy, which is sort of her performance work through the 80s that is as she would want it. What we've been really thinking about is how to deal with these categories that that really go against any type of strict self-selecting kind of group. I mean, I was jokingly thinking, what Carolee would have loved would just to have the catalogue raisonné Carolee Schneemann paintings, but it includes everything, including performances and films. And these are sort of questions that we grapple with. So I think the idea of how much scrutiny to give her own documentation is an important one. I think it's one that that we think seriously about it, because like Abramovich, Schneemann also sort of dictated how things were shot, either through directions with photographers or simply by having close relationships with them. She was married to Anthony McCall, and they certainly had a type of working relationship that was very intimate. So we are giving a lot of, I guess we're giving a lot of scrutiny to the documentation, but also taking a lot of it as very helpful as we try to pin down where things are.
Thank you. And you raised the whole issue of categorization, which is particularly fascinating in Carolee's situation. And of course, the early work, which we see in the exhibition in the Barbican, is painting. And you make the really interesting point about her considering herself a painter throughout her life, even though she deviates, quite far from that. But given that is traditional and is traditional in the form of documentation, and we're all very used to catalogue raisonnés on painting, how do you put all of those things together in one document and give them equal weight? Because the painting exists and it is itself, but the performative work is just a documentation of something that has already taken place. How for the sake of her legacy and her performative work is so important. How do you get that balance right?
Good question. I'm not sure that we've gotten it right yet. And I think what we're hoping is that that we can implement sort of ways of archiving that we have, but also technologies that we can kind of employ, right? So we have a lot of video footage of the works. We have all of these, we have videos that she edited, but we also have footage of the actual performances, and those are sort of different takes on things. In an ideal situation, we would be able to then share both the archival footage and the edited versions that are artworks in their own rights, and sort of have those both available for researchers. But I think the question of how we get that right is one we haven't yet sort of solved. And I think in a way that's different than how Abramovich was discussing the kind of training of people to make performances. Carolee was quite clear that she really preferred for no reenactments to take place of her work. And in a way that helps us out, I think, because it gives us a kind of firm endpoint to performances. It lets us kind of figure out where they stop and start. But it also means that we're trying to interweave all of these different mediums and films, and that we rely a lot on the artist herself and her own sort of documentation for it, as opposed to perhaps the experience of others performing it or instructions that she gave. There's a lot of sort of post-performance kind of editing work that goes into, I think, how it has been documented, and that's something we're really working strongly to try to figure out.
Good, thank you. I mean, you mentioned about the filming and photography that she did herself, which is really important, and presumably that the technology that we have now and being able to present a catalogue raisonné in a digital form is something that's enormously useful to document a artistic career of someone like Carolee, and how it's kind of, it pushes against the traditions of a kind of book and volume. And one would imagine that, an online digital interactive catalogue raisonné is going to be incredibly interesting, because all of that archival footage can become a very fundamental part of it.
Absolutely. I think the opportunities afforded us through a kind of digital catalog raisonné rather than a print one are really great, so that we can do not only just include much more, but as you said, include the time-based things. I mean, one of the things that I would love to do for even the paintings that are static, right, would be to show videos of pinwheel spinning, because that's how it's intended to be, that there's sort of activation within a lot of the works. Her series of boxes, for example, that, yes, we could show an image of one without movement or light or any type of action, and one with, and have two static stills, or we could show a kind of video of the piece itself kind of activated. And I think that this, the ability to sort of make clear that even the paintings tended to have some sort of active component is something that we're really excited about the digital catalog raisonné for.
Thank you. I'm also kind of fascinated about the moment. I mean, she had a long career, but the moment in which she lived. She started off as a painter. She was very influenced by abstract expressionism, and when you think, you made reference to Pollock in her work, and that was something that she was very conscious of. But immediately, that quote that Harold Rosenberg wrote in 1952 about each artist is using the canvas as an arena to perform in. I mean, she really is the absolute embodiment of it, and up to including her limits she is absolutely enacting that. So she was very much in her time. But the other thing about living very much in her time was her political affiliations, and how she was very responsive in her work to things that were happening at the time politically, like the Vietnam War, but also you mentioned, feminism and cruelty to animals. And how do you keep the sense of those being very urgent things at the time, and how they fed into her work? How do you keep them very current within a catalogue raisonné and documentation?
That's something that's very important. Agreed. One of the things I think that will be really helpful for us is simply to try to contextualize, through longer form essays about how urgent these moments were, because it is so lost. So an example of this is in the Barbican catalog, Kenneth White has written an essay that really sort of puts the moment of Viet Flakes and her Vietnam War kind of imagery into context. And I think we're going to have to do that for many of these moments in order to remind, our viewers to be able to take the sort of specificity of it beyond just, yes, of course, she was an anti-war protest, et cetera. But this question of mediation, I think, is so important with Carolee. And so what's required is the scholarship to be able to remind us that, these images weren't available to the American public, that this is why they were critical. This is the context that they were torn out from by Carolee. And so I think for us, it's a matter of just generating more scholarship around all of those issues so that we can contextualize them properly. So we're looking at lots of bells and whistles, I suppose, in the technological realm, but also some very heady scholarship, we hope, as well.
And I think that, the Barbican exhibition is absolutely wonderful. And I know that you were very involved in that, Rachel. And as well as effectively highlighting all of those concerns that she had at the time, it goes back to the earlier point we were discussing about, giving weight to certain things, making sure that the performative work, physically it's given a lot of space, and rightly so within the exhibition. How helpful are exhibitions like that to your sort of work in shaping the legacy?
Oh, I think they're incredibly helpful. The Barbican exhibition has been wonderful, not only because it's introduced her to a new audience in the UK, et cetera, but also because it gives us a chance and a curatorial team the opportunity to really sort of sift through those archives again and to kind of figure out new avenues of research. It also, I think, gives us ways to understand how performance can be presented, both kind of, and that would be helpful for the catalog raisonné, but also in exhibition. So thinking about the ways in which Up to and Including Her Limits is shown, sometimes with 4 monitors, sometimes with 6, sometimes with 3, these sort of what seem like, somewhat just kind of questions of presentation, but start to really become important as we track every time this has been shown. What were the decisions that Carolee made? Were they, why were they made? And then how do we create an experience for the viewer? So one of the things that the Barbican does so well is give us kind of a series of performance photos that one can walk through, and the installation itself, but also the archival documentation. So you have these sort of 3 avenues with which to enter a piece, that would have been a performance that perhaps you missed. And I think, in particular, Up to and Including Her Limits and Interior Scroll in the exhibition do a really nice job of trying to kind of give you a full view of something that isn't, that can't be experienced directly, but it's as much information as you can provide.
Thank you. Do we have time for any questions from the floor? No, Teresa's telling me no. Rachel, thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting, and we thank you for your valuable contribution.
Thank you, Edith. I appreciate it. Have a nice day.